Long before she became the first female president of Harvard, Drew Gilpin Faust grew up in a conservative family in the 1950s South, when support for segregation and reverence for the Confederacy were unquestioned assumptions of everyday life. But she didn't let her surroundings define her. At just 9 years old, Faust wrote President Dwight Eisenhower, urging him to integrate schools. That letter is now in Eisenhower's presidential library. And the spirit behind it has carried Faust through decades of activism and examination, studying the history of the injustices that she saw growing up. She describes that coming-of-age journey in her new memoir, Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century. Drew Gilpin Faust joins me now. Drew, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So I have to say that your memoir just, maybe it's the lyricism of the prose, but it made the centrality of racial assumptions in everyday life in sort of the era in which you grew up visceral to me in a way that very few other things I've read have.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. That's what I'd hope to do by combining a kind of memoir with a historical context. So thank you.
So I have to ask, what is it that made you, unlike, I should say almost all the contemporaries you talk about in your memoir, sort of rebel against that world?
I'm not sure. Obviously, I could speculate and have speculated in the book. I think one part of it was growing up with three brothers and feeling that they were allowed all kinds of privileges that I was not, and I was expected to restrict my behavior in ways that they were not. And that I just thought that was unfair. And my logical little mind said, why should they get this and not me? And why should I have to do this and not they? And it went back and forth. So maybe it was partly also the little rational brain of mine ticking away in the circumstances of family dynamics in which I found myself. I think it also, to be honest, is a part of the moment that I arrived on the scene, which was when things were just beginning to change. In the 1954 Supreme Court decision mandating integration of schools, Virginia had a really violent reaction to that and said we would prefer to close our schools rather than integrate them. So there was a lot of debate around that. And so questions were in the air that hadn't been for, say, my aunts and grandmothers and mother and so forth. And I think that set a context in which my rebelliousness expressed itself.
So today, many more people claim to have been on the right side of history than actually were. And I'm just curious, have you gone back to sort of any of the people you grew up with and said, do you regret not standing with me on the bridge?
No, I'm not that kind of person. Accusatory reflection is not a very productive stance. I did just go back to the community I grew up in the aftermath of the publication of the book in late August. And I was a little scared about that and wasn't sure how people were going to receive it. But they seemed fascinated and welcoming and accepting that, recognizing I'd always been a little different. I'd always been rebellious. I always was kind of an odd duck. And now that odd duckness is acceptable in a way it wasn't when I was younger. So maybe a kind of reconciliation about it all.
So I have to say, I didn't think of that question as accusatory, right? Because I think most people, even if they wouldn't take on the full sort of racial hierarchy even of today's life, they would say, I know who was right back then. And it's interesting to ask, is there any sort of question of what does that say about the way I view the world today that maybe I didn't pick that side right back then?
That is, in a sense, the thrust, what you're describing, the thrust of much of my scholarly work, which has been to ask how people come to convince themselves of positions that we, looking back, find unacceptable or horrifying. And what is it that enables them to justify these blindnesses? And therefore, what can we learn from their behavior that has relevance for us today? We're doing things today, I'm sure, that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and successors will find horrifying. And sometimes I wonder what they are. We eat meat. My daughter's a vegetarian. She doesn't assail me about it, but I wonder if generations from now people will look at us and say, how could you possibly have eaten meat? Or climate, how could we possibly have done what we have to the climate? There are just many ways in which our taken for granted assumptions and ways of living are going to look bewildering, if not terrifying and horrifying to those who come after us. And how can we understand those better in our own moment instead of waiting to have them be brought to task by those who succeed us?
So on our very first date, my wife and I both agreed that our hypothetical grandkids at the time would look at us as barbarians for eating meat. That was the thing we thought.
You can tell right away.
So I wonder then that this awakening for you to injustice, right? We're in a time today of sort of incredible ferment over injustices in society, that incredible divisions. It's not 1968, but maybe it's not that far from it. Do you learn something from your history of awakening to those that you would apply to America today and say, how do we get other people to come to that same realization?
Well, I wouldn't say apply in a direct sense of here's my lesson to you, but a message that I hope people take from this book is a confidence in the possibility of change and a recognition that things have changed because people pushed against them and brought about change, and that therefore we should not feel despairing. We have that opportunity once again, and we must have hope, and we must believe in ourselves and our ability to change, even in what look like such extremely challenging and difficult circumstances.
So if there is one moment for you where you would say you had a realization, right, that the world is not as it should be, what's the one that you would want people to understand?
Well, the moment I write about in the book as my epiphany on race occurred when I was 9 years old and I was being driven home from school by an African-American man who worked for my family. And there was a radio announcer talking about some of these racial conflicts that I referred to earlier in Virginia in the aftermath of Brown v. Board. And I suddenly realized that my school was not white by accident, that in fact, Black people had been specifically excluded from my school under the rubrics and laws of segregation in Virginia. And I was just horrified. I was horrified because it was unfair. I was also horrified because no one had told me, and people had been keeping this very important understanding from me. And so I felt two things. First, I have to combat this unfairness. And secondly, who can I trust? And who can I rely on when I've been told all these things that turn out to be quite different from the way I'd understood them? And so I went home and I wrote the letter to Eisenhower that you showed in the initial clips and urged him to support integration and to behave in accordance with both democratic and Christian values. That was the language I used. And I ended the letter, please, Mr. Eisenhower, please let colored people, as the wording was in those days, colored people go to schools and other things. So this was a moment for me when suddenly things became clear, which I just hadn't seen before that moment.
So you went from that sort of realization in the background and then eventually became president of Harvard, where I should tell our viewers I was your least important employee. And was there anything you took from that experience to the presidency?
That's such a big question. Yes, many things. One was a commitment to inclusion and racial justice, also gender justice. I was the first woman president of Harvard, and so in a sense, my very existence in Mass Hall in the president's office marked a departure for Harvard, a new movement towards, I think, a more just institution. And I hoped and tried and struggled, and I think to some degree succeeded in opening Harvard up in a variety of dimensions and increasing representation of African Americans and other marginalized individuals on the faculty and the student body and so forth. So that was part of it. But I think something else that came from it was just, you've got to ask questions. And your mode of operation as a human being is going to tend to make you complacent, make you just accept what's around you, make you get used to a dailiness of life. But you always have to be challenging yourself and saying, what is right and what is wrong about the way I'm living? And how could it be better? And what can I do to make it better? And how can I try to eliminate some of these blindnesses that so affect human beings as they move through the world?
Dr. Faust, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.